All right. Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Quinn Gardner. I'm the Deputy Director of Emergency Management for the city. We are going to be recording this evening's community meeting so that we can share it with your neighbors and folks that might not have been able to attend afterwards. So if you're not comfortable with that, go ahead and cut your camera. We will have two different opportunities for questions, the second of which will be after we stop the recording. So you can ask questions at that time if you're most comfortable. So with that, I'd like to ask Mary and then Lauren to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Mary Scramstad, Wildfire Mitigation Project Coordinator. And I work for Center for Fire, and I've been kind of heading the parking box program.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Davini, Senior Traffic Engineer with San Rafael Public Works. And Public Works' role in this project is to make sure the signage and striping gets done. So that kind of comes after the fire assessment.
Thanks, Mary and Lauren. Of course, I'd be amiss if I didn't mention our Deputy Chief Sennett's joining us today, and he's got some pictures of himself that he might not even know are in the presentation. So thanks for being here, Chief.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. We will monitor the chat throughout. So if you feel comfortable using the chat for questions, you can do that, and we'll try to address those a couple different places in the presentation. And we're going to go ahead and dive into the content. And again, if you can just remember to keep yourself muted and keep yourself off video if you're not comfortable with the recording. So our agenda this evening, I'm going to spend a little bit of time providing some information about the background, kind of how we got here, which will include our outreach, pilot projects, things like that. Lauren's going to provide an overview of the rules and standards relating to parking. Mary's going to cover some of the information about how we went about evaluating and making the decisions we made. And then we'll take some questions at that point about the evaluation process in the background. And then we'll dive into some more specific solution-oriented, as well as answering some of the questions we got ahead of time. And then we'll end with a live Q&A, and we'll cut the recording at that point for anyone that feels more comfortable asking questions off of the recording. But again, you're welcome to use the chat throughout. So a little bit of the background here. The work we're doing around safe parking is really just one of many different things the city is doing as it comes to wildfire prevention and community safety. San Rafael was actually really ahead of the game in terms of taking steps to reduce wildfire potential here. Going even in 2007 is when we first adopted updated vegetation standards, largely focused on the removal of juniper within the wildland urban interface. But there was obviously been not enough had been done between then and in the 2017-18 timeline. And then we had, of course, a lot of fires in 2018, including the North Bay. And that was when we got very specific direction from the city council at the time to create a really bold, unbudget restrained plan to prevent what happened in Sonoma from happening in San Rafael, essentially. And so that ultimately became a 38-point action plan called the Wildfire Prevention and Protection Action Plan, which, as you can see there, was well over a year in its drafting. Multiple iterations. It probably was up to 50 points at one point. Quite the list, really looking at a 360 approach. And through that process, we also established a Citizens Wildfire Advisory Committee. It was about 15 folks that represented all the different geographic areas of the city, and met with then Mayor Phillips as well as Councilmember Bushy to go over every point of the plan and discuss it in detail and really provide that resident perspective. And a lot of changes were made to the plan based on that feedback. And then council formally adopted the plan, but the plan still was just a plan, right? It was a roadmap forward. It didn't actually legally change anything. That comes a little later, but in the interim, once the plan was adopted around, well, the timelines are back and forth a little bit, if you will, but tax voters approved tax measure C, which created the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, which annually produces about $20 million countywide for us to spend on wildfire prevention and adaptation. So this is one project we're working under that scope, but there's a lot of other things going on. And so I just want to take a quick moment specifically to plug our grant program and our Chipper Day program. So there's a lot of resources available to residents. So if you need help creating defensible space or adapting your landscape to vegetation, there is money available. There is free chipper services available. We'll give you some links at the end of the presentation. We also do a lot of work on our city-owned open space. We're doing a lot of other evacuation improvements related to roadside vegetation removal as well. We have our citywide evaluation inspection program that's really one-on-one education with property owners, helping them understand what they can do to adapt their landscape. And there's a lot of other things we're doing, our GOAT program that everybody loves, and all sorts of other things. And so as we started kind of rolling and looking at this 360 approach and starting to work through the action plan, we had to go back to City Council to actually start implementing some of the recommended ordinance changes that were in the action plan. And so in February of 21 is actually when we went back to City Council, which is a 2-meeting process. So that process had 2 public meetings. And during the first one, we presented the safe parking program, or the parking box program, to City Council, took community input, all of that kind of feedback. And then City Council took that feedback and directed us to come back at the next meeting, which is when they can formally adopt something. And so that's really when the law, if you will, around parking changed. But all that really did was establish the parking box program. It didn't actually change a lot of the other parking restrictions that are in place that Lauren's going to talk about. So that's just a little bit of the background. The parking and the evacuation is just one component of everything the city and the county are doing to help us adapt to wildfire and avoid some of the devastation we've seen in other communities. So as part of all of this, we did our first parking box or safe parking program as a pilot on San Rafael Lincoln Hill, partly because of fire history, road conditions, all those things. And these are steps we've implemented as we've moved this project throughout the city. So extensive outreach, we've done direct mailers, we included in our discussions as part of our defensible space evaluations. We're being very intentional about doing the roadside vegetation management first. And so we're going through and clearing vegetation, especially hazardous highly combustible vegetation, away from the roadside, and making sure we have proper vertical clearance. And the goal by doing that first is we might actually be creating additional space for people to park. We're taking in engine feedback, resident feedback, and then we went and actually installed the parking boxes and the signage. And then we did case-by-case reviews, and there was probably over a dozen specific cases that we went back and we met with a property owner to reevaluate and see, does it make sense? Can we put something here? And in many cases, we're able to accommodate, and in some weren't, but found other solutions, or were able to help the resident understand why. So we've taken this pilot project that's been probably about 6 or 8 months ago now at this point. Time is confusing for me these days. And we've moved forward into other areas of the city. And Mary will explain a little bit about how we picked other areas of the city. But before we get there, we've spent a lot of time developing the action plan. Like I said, it was a multi-year process. During that process, we did dozens of meetings with homeowners associations, neighborhood associations, community-wide meetings, city council, various other kind of groups, whether it was CERT or neighborhood response groups, or Elks or Key Club, or you name it, right? Any type of group that would have us, ongoing social media, website, digital presence, a lot of direct mail, and then direct outreach for folks that we have contact information with community leaders. And so all of that outreach and all of that process kind of led us to figuring out the best way to do that. And so that's kind of the outreach process. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk a little bit about kind of existing rules and how they apply here.
Thanks, Quinn. So getting into one of the signs that is pretty common in the hillside areas is that that parking sign that says you can park off to the side as long as you leave 6 feet to the center of the roadway. And we are trying to get away from that signage because it's confusing. It's confusing to install. It's confusing to enforce. It's difficult to enforce because it's really vague. And so if you call for like a parking complaint, parking services has a challenge enforcing it. And it's been around for a while, but there are still problems on some streets. Next slide. So some of the traffic laws and minimum requirements are, there's different widths depending on what that lane is being used for. If it's a parking lane, a bike lane, or a vehicle lane. So a vehicle lane, the standard width is about 11 feet. You can go down to about 10 feet in some spaces, but for emergency services, 11 to 12 feet is actually really preferred because of their wider vehicles and the mirrors and the doors and needing to get in and out. Parking spot, when you're talking about like a space parallel to the roadway, that it can go down to about 7 feet. Our spaces downtown where we have more width might be about 8 feet wide. There's turning radius that we need to look out for, and we have programs that can model that called auto turn. Those can be really conservative, and so we've had a lot of success and probably saved quite a few parking spaces in our pilot project by actually just having the fire engine go down the streets, and we can get an accurate assessment of how tight is a curve, or can a fire truck fit where maybe the model said it wouldn't. So that's been really nice to work with the fire department to get those radiuses done in real time. And then the minimum width of a road for a new construction, which we don't see a lot of in San Rafael. We're dealing with old constraints, but that minimum width is 20 feet, and that would just be enough for 2 10-foot travel lanes. No parking on the side, no marked bike lane. So those are kind of the requirements or the widths that we're starting with.
Thanks, Lauren. And I think hearing what that new foot, I was actually, when it was like 20 foot versus like we do 11 some places, I think really kind of reiterates, although we obviously, in most cases in the city, can't add 9 feet to our roadways, we need to be looking at how we can create as much of that safe space as possible. So that's really helpful. I appreciate that.
And so some of the options, I think this project started as simply a parking box project, but as we go through the streets, not every street is the same. There's places where parking boxes just aren't appropriate. And so after we finished Lincoln Hill and now we're looking at Gerstle Park and West End, we're finding that more streets kind of fit the red curb and signage go that way instead of the parking box route. So that's, we made some decisions and notified folks, which streets are getting parking boxes and which ones would be getting red curb and signage. And yeah, eliminating parking entirely on a side is another option. Eliminating parking completely is an option, although, we try to do that in as few locations as possible. And then another thing you can do is just restrict larger vehicles. And we have signs for that, like, we don't want RVs or something which are larger, they're taller, they're wider, they really block sight lines, limiting some of those vehicles on some streets.
All right, so I'm going to take over the evaluation process. The first step I did was look at the evacuation areas and see where the challenges are, especially when there's only one exit in and one exit out, or if there's only 2 exits. However, there might be chokeholds or areas where people would bottleneck and have to either do a U-turn or turn around in order to get out safely. So definitely looking at those narrow roads and looking at the hillside areas that will have a lot of trouble getting out. Next slide.
Thanks, Mary. Just real quick, I want to make my shameless emergency management plug for the two resources that are here for everybody. One is Zone Haven, which is a new platform that we have countywide. We'll share you the link at the end as well, but it's a public facing, it'll be very helpful if we have to evacuate, creates zones so people know how to evacuate, that's connected to our emergency alerting system. But on the operations end, on our end, we can actually do modeling off of it, where it can tell us how many vehicles and evacuation times and things like that. So that's another tool in our toolbox as we go through and we evaluate these. And then that bottom URL is the county's emergency portal. So if something's ever happening and you're not quite sure what, that's the website to go to. And that gets updated during any type of evacuation or fire situation or other emergency. And then has some good standard preparedness information and links and resources as well. So
Thank you. So the next step I took and my former colleague took before I took over the project was he interviewed the fire crews and asked them, where do they have challenges? Where are they finding that they can't get through? Where do they have to get out of the vehicle and direct traffic or the driver in order to get through? This photo here kind of depicts the issue that I had in Lincoln Hill, where we wanted to put parking, but we couldn't because the fire engine was just not able to get through. The fireman had to get out of the vehicle. He had to direct traffic, and in an emergency, this is all going to be very time consuming. And if your home is on fire, every minute matters. Additionally, if there's a fire nearby, the fireman getting out of the vehicle is going to put himself in danger as well. Next slide. The third step I took was looking at the widths of the roads. So I didn't go street by street to measure first. I looked at the data that's available online to identify and pre-plan before I went out. We did go road by road. Next slide. We did go road by road with PVC pipes. The one on the left, Chief Sinnott, is the fire engine. It's 12 feet wide. And on the right, that's me, is 7 feet. So we were going by street with these pipes and measuring exactly where we could potentially put in parking, anywhere that was safe. And we used exact measurements and we walked every single street that is on the list for changes. Next slide. The following step that I took was analyzing how much space is needed in order for the fire engine to safely move, not operate, but just to get through safely without having to have one of the firefighters get out and tell the driver how to get through. So the minimum width needed just to get through the street is 12 feet. Now, we already said that the minimum access road for the California Fire Code for new construction is 20 feet. Now, looking at also the rule that already exists with 6 feet from the center of the road, you're looking at 6 and 6, that's 12. And on either end, that's another 6. So there are roads where you cannot add any parking if we're going by the 6 foot center of the road. However, if we're only allowing access to get through, then we need a minimum of 13 feet and we're allowing 7 feet for parking so that the fire engine can open its doors. Now, the schematic on the left clearly depicts the amount of parking that we can safely add while the fire engine can come through and at least open its door.
Thanks, Mary. Before we move off of the schematic, because I want to give people a second to absorb it, I think what's really interesting for me when I look at this is if you look at that 6 feet from center, and then let's just even conservatively say a 6 foot parking spot on either side. By current city rules, a 24 foot wide road could not have parking on it, because by the time a vehicle, right, was in that 6 feet, it would be interfering with that 6 feet from center line. And so we're actually creating more parking, more legal, safe parking by restricting parking to one side of the street, because we know we can have safe parking and still allow that access road. Because right now, actually, some of this middle schematic, you couldn't legally park based on our existing 6 foot from center rule. So I think that's really important for folks to understand that we're actually trying to create more safe parking while maintaining that access path, not just for fire engines, but for evacuation, for garbage trucks, for delivery drivers, all of those larger vehicles that need to get in and out of our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Quinn. Now, I did want to add these photos with our fabulous photographer, Quinn. You can see the PVC pipe, the same PVC pipe we use to walk the streets. It's 12 feet. And here it is in front of the fire engine and in front of the paramedic. So you can see that opening the door, it's barely enough. Same with the paramedics. It's barely enough space. And it's not enough space to actually operate. Next slide. So as you can see here, the fire engine has equipment that needs to be pulled out. The ladder needs at least 2 feet, and the oxygen tank needs another 2.5 feet. Plus you need space for the firefighter to be able to equip it. The next step that I took was observing the existing parking patterns. We looked at blind spots and curves. We looked at signs of parking like grease stains, because we know that folks are not at home during the times that we are walking these. So we try to account for the areas that people were already using to try and keep those spots. However, as Quinn said, it's not always possible. So we definitely did our best to be able to add these spots if it was appropriate. We also looked at driveways and the turn radius for people to be able to come out of their driveway and safely exit. There were areas where we had neighbors call me to come back out for adjustments. And they asked their other neighbor with the driveway for permission to install the parking box in front of their driveway. If the other owner was okay with installing a parking box there, and they were okay with safely exiting their driveway without having it impede their access, then I went back and I added another parking spot. However, this all takes communication and community to be able to talk to each other and be everybody to be on the same page and have the ability to take into account that other people have to be safe as well. And even though parking is really important, safety is too. So I also took into account the evacuation direction. So the direction that you should go in case of an emergency, which means that we don't want people to be doing turnarounds, doing U-turns. We kind of want people to go one way. And so there were areas where I made the decision to have parking on one side, the side that was downhill. In some cases, I made that decision because it made more parking. In some cases, I made the decision because it's in the evacuation route. In some areas where we couldn't tell whether there were bottlenecks or if people were even parking there because there weren't clear signs, we definitely knocked on doors, and we also waved people down who were walking their dogs and asked questions because we don't live there. So we have to ask people these questions. After we sent out the letters, I got a lot of calls. I got a lot of emails, over 30 calls and emails, and people either said, great job, and I agree with this, or they said, hey, I would like to have another evaluation, or hey, I don't want this parking spot here because it's my property, or it impedes my access to my driveway. So we went out and we made adjustments, whether it means decreasing the size of a box or increasing the size of a box by a couple feet. Next slide. So after we did all of our analysis, we went back out and, or while we were out there, we marked the spots where we would put in parking boxes or make the determination if we can install no parking signs on one side of the road. One example I have here is Knoll Road, which kind of like what I said before, if I had put in the no parking on the other side, you can see that there would be less parking than parking on the side with the undeveloped land. So by putting parking on that side, you create more parking than putting it in front of people's houses. This also is the direction of evacuation. So luckily this went hand in hand. So more parking and the evacuation route, everything worked out well. I did put in no parking around the bends so that there would be a clear path for the fire engine, and also no blind spots for the people that are also driving. Next slide. So the final step 8, I think this is the final step. We do have the fire engine drive through, and typically I have them drive through a little bit after we do the analysis. However, because of our community meetings, I'm going to have the engine drive through all of them, and I try to make it as late as possible. So the next date that they're available is going to be next Monday. So please take a picture of this and mark your calendars. The fire engine will start in Gerstle Park on Reservoir and make their way all the way through Fair Hills. Now, this may take an hour and a half. If they get a call, they may have to go and they may come back or reschedule. So if you don't see them, do not worry. They may or may not come because they are active firefighters and they may not be able to stay the whole time. Though it's scheduled to start at 6. And if I need to schedule it again, we will schedule it another day, and I will let everybody know through the same means that you found out about this meeting. I will be out there too if you want to ask any questions, and I'll be taking photos and videos, and feel free to take photos and videos and ask firefighters questions if you'd like. I definitely encourage everybody to come out so that you can observe the fire engine go through your neighborhood and really pay attention to where they have challenges, where do they have to slow down, and where did they have to stop. Next slide. Lauren.
Okay, so this slide focuses on Fair Hills Drive. Fair Hills is, I don't know, one of the more rare streets that we're dealing with in that it is pretty much about 22 feet wide all the way up. It's also really curvy and hilly, and so there's a center line to help people stay on the correct side of the road. There's existing signage that says no parking within I get so confused by that sign, I forget what it says. No parking if you can't leave 6 feet to the center. And so when you have a double yellow, you can't go over it to pass. So it's not really possible to have a car parked even if they're parked as close to the edge of the road as possible without another car that needs to go get down the hill without another car having to go over the center line. So for that, parking really should have never been allowed on this street. I think that this project just formalizes it. And yeah, it just gets down to, you need to stay, that double yellow needs to be on your left-hand side as you're driving, and you can't go over it. And I think that's all I have to say on this slide.
Thanks, Lauren. So we'll pause here for any Q&A on the evaluation process. Again, we are recording, so if you'd rather hold your questions till after we stop the recording, we can come back to this. But before we dive into some other specifics, does anybody have questions on the background or the evaluation process? You can unmute yourself or use the chat. Give it one more second. Anybody have any questions? Okay, and again, we'll have another opportunity for more questions in here and a bit in the presentation. So really quickly, and Mary, jump in and elaborate on these. We certainly understand, right? Parking is a big concern. It's a big function of living, especially in areas where we're super car dependent. And so we understand that in some cases it's going to feel like we're taking away parking that might have already been illegal, or in some cases we might be taking away parking for the good of the whole and public safety. And so we want to talk about some solutions and some other opportunities to help with that. So one of them is creating more off-street parking. So we've got kind of the informal blessing from City Council to work with folks on a case-by-case basis. So if you have space, maybe you need to build a little bit of a retaining wall, or you need to change your landscaping a little bit. But if you have that potential to add more off-street parking, we're here to help you do that, especially if there's any type of ADA concerns or anything else like that, because we understand that's there, and we'll handle that on a case-by-case basis. Before I move on, Mary, anything to add on this one?
I just want to say that there are people who are doing this, and there are people who have already done this in the past. It is definitely a possibility. So definitely reach out and see if you can get this done, if that's what you're interested in.
Great, thank you. Another option is our city parking permit. So in 2012, the city developed this policy for residential permits. We actually don't have this implemented anywhere in the city. A few neighborhoods have thought about it and considered it. And then when you kind of look at the requirements, it's never come through. It is a minimum of 1,500 residents participating, and that the neighborhood has to agree by a 2/3 majority to implement the permit process. You can see the pros and cons there. Is that this is one way to address kind of we have a lot of people outside the neighborhood parking here situation, and potentially then retain more parking availability for residents. However, it's not changing, it's not creating parking. It can be more inconvenient when it comes to visitors and gardeners and things like that. But it is an option. It is a tool in the toolbox if it's something your neighborhood is interested in pursuing. We're happy to send you more information about this. And you can work directly with the parking services manager, Jim Myers, is happy to help answer questions about that as well. And then the third kind of other alternative option is looking at hour limitations on how long people can park somewhere. So we've done this in the canal as an example. This can be helpful to eliminating vehicles that kind of stay on the road for longer periods of time. However, I think we've all gone probably more than 24 hours, especially in the last few years, without leaving our house. And that can certainly be inconvenient. but it is a way to kind of make sure that those spots are being used by people that need them for a short-term basis or things like that. So these are all things we're happy to, consider exploring with you if that feels like a good option for your street or for your neighborhood. There's pros and cons to every option, of course, and public safety is what we're going to view everything with. Anything to add on those last two, Mary?
No, I think that's, again, these are alternatives and we will not be doing any of these without the consideration of the residents. So feel free to reach out if you feel strongly and talk to your community. The number one thing to get everybody to understand this is by talking to each other. So I definitely encourage everybody to talk with each other and get on the same page so that you can all live peacefully.
Thanks, Mary. I see a question about the permit process work for off-street. So if you're interested in creating off-street parking, reach out to Mary or Lauren, and we can work with you. There's not this permitting process. Think of this more as like we all have city staff employee parking tags, which means we can park in certain lots. This would be something similar where like you can park in your neighborhood if you have a permit. There obviously is other potential construction permits and things like that. If you're potentially, depends on if you just have like a flat green lawn and you just want to put some gravel down, I don't know, actually. I guess that's a good question for DPW. But if you're getting into any kind of construction, or at a minimum, you might need an encroachment permit to do the work. That's probably a public works question, but we're happy to address those on a case-by-case basis. So these are some of the common questions that we've gotten. And I really like this particular example that Mary put in here. So what is off-street parking, right? So fully off-street. So a public road is exactly that. It's a public road. Just because that's always the place on a public road you park doesn't actually mean it's your section of public road. And so you really do need to be fully off-street. So these are great examples where people have created some of that off-street parking, either with retaining walls or flattening out a little bit of their landscape. The image on the right with the red, right? This person is in the public right of way and is also forcing a vehicle, like Lauren mentioned, to potentially have to go in across the double yellow line to pass that vehicle. So this is a perfect opportunity, if just kind of looking at this landscape, is it seems like they could mimic what the person on the left has done and maybe create a little bit of retaining wall. We can do, work with you on a curb cut, and you could actually create some off-street parking. So you could still have this additional parking without coming into the public right of way, so that it looks like the things on the left more. Mary, you want to cover this one?
Yeah, so I have gotten the question of, well, I've been parking on the sidewalk forever, but forever, nobody's supposed to be parking on the sidewalk. It is California legislation that you cannot park on the sidewalk, or you can't even block your driveway according to California legislature. So I really want to encourage people not to park on the sidewalk, moreover, because of ADA rules. So we do have people with strollers, we have people in wheelchairs that also need to access these parts, and they need to be able to use the sidewalk. And the sidewalk is it's a public feature that everybody should be able to use, not just your vehicle.
Thanks, Mary. You want to cover this one?
Yeah. So I did want to cover the question is, how does the city intend to monitor the enforced no parking impact on nearby streets? Now, we don't know what the impact will be until the impact is done. So we do encourage everybody to reach out. You guys have my information. You got in the letters. My information is on the letters, and you can email me, you can call me, and let me know what the impact is, what the impact you're observing. And if we need to make adjustments, we will. In the photo, you can see one example is that somebody told me that on the other side of the street, somebody's been parking and that doesn't allow enough space. And I could not extend the parking box on the other side because then that would limit parking on the other side. So it's kind of taking into consideration that both neighbors need to be able to park, and I can accommodate parking on one side or the other side, but I can't accommodate parking on both sides. So I was able to put in parking boxes in the back, and there was also parking boxes in the front. However, being able to meet the space in between is really important. So talking to both neighbors and coming to a conclusion that works for everybody. Again, we're also looking for win-wins, and we want everybody to be able to live peacefully with each other and be able to have the safety feeling that you can have access to a fire engine and paramedics when you need them.
Thanks, Mary. And the other thing I'd say that kind of comes up for me in this question a little bit in terms of how do we intend to monitor and the enforcement piece. is that like we did on the pilot project in Santa Fe Lincoln Hill, from an enforcement standpoint, we start with a warning period, somewhere in the 4 to 8 week range. And then we move into ticketing. And then eventually we have the opportunity, if we can legally tow. We don't want to go down that route, but it's certainly something we'd consider more on things like red flag days, where we know we might need that emergency access is going to be that much more important. But we're hoping through warning and education, we can adjust behaviors, and we've already seen, right after we launched the pilot project on Santa Fe Lincoln Hill, there were a couple months of a lot of communication and a lot of questions and comments, and I think folks have already adjusted to it, and that's just the safe parking environment. And now they know engines can get to them, and they know engines can operate where they need to operate, and we've got a much safer situation in that area, and that's what we hope to mimic across the city. So we talked a lot about this, and I think understanding that we really do need that 12 feet. And I hope those visuals really helped. It's not just about the physical width of a vehicle, especially with our fire engines. They need space on either side of that vehicle to safely operate. You don't want the engine to have to pull right up against an edge with a steep slope where the firefighter literally is going to get hurt or can't operate or can't access the medical bag that they need to come help respond to the medical call at your home or something like that. So it's really important that it's not just physically the drive space, but also that any given home could have to have an engine in front of it during a response. And we want to make sure that we can do that and we can respond as quickly as possible to serve our community while keeping our firefighters safe. We've gotten some questions about maintenance and maintenance vehicles, and I'll cover this and then see if Mary or Lauren have anything to add. I think the specific question was, can we switch the side of parking so it's not under the power lines? So when PG&E's there, it's not interrupted. We can look at obviously that individual situation, but any road work or any maintenance type work that is going to encroach or interfere with the roadway requires those folks to go through the encroachment permit process where they work with Public Works, and the city's notified. And during those time periods, we could certainly suspend or alter parking adjustments to make sure things stay on. And something like this, they're going to have traffic control in place to have people go around. We might be able to make those temporary modifications, especially knowing that those vehicles encroaching on the roadway are occupied, right? So if there is an emergency, they can immediately move and adjust, and they're not a vehicle that's been left there unstaffed essentially. So Mary or Lauren, anything to add on that?
Just really quickly, another thing to note that when there is maintenance, usually it is planned. So city or others will put out signs that say on Tuesday of April 5th, there will be maintenance. So do not park here between 9 and 5. So we really want to take into consideration that in any case, if there is an emergency, there will be traffic control. It will be fully staffed. Someone will be there to move the traffic and you will be able to pass. But again, this is all kind of forecasting things that have not happened. But we predict that it will be fully staffed. There's no reason why it wouldn't be staffed.
Yeah, and I think the other piece there too is when we have, especially any type of like full road closure or anything, that goes out to our suppression crews so that our engines are aware of it before they even leave the station. So they're not driving up to a potential roadblock, having to turn around. They're detouring on the way there, and therefore their response times aren't as impacted. Okay, so this is a great question. This might be my favorite question we got, because I love getting people educated on all the different things they can do to be better prepared and safer and just all hazard thinking. So essentially, like how do we work to get better at evacuations and being more prepared? So there's a variety of ways I can answer this question. We're happy to do evacuation drills. So if your neighborhood's interested in that, please reach out to us and we can look at helping coordinate that. We can set a date and time and coordinate alerting and all sorts of things like that. FireWise is a great program if your neighborhood hasn't already looked into that. What it really does is focus on getting everybody to work together, because a fire adapted neighborhood is what's really going to make a difference. We can all do what we can around our own properties, but we really want to see our neighborhoods adapt. And there's actually funding now going into FireWise, and there's also insurance benefits in some insurance providers to FireWise. So there's a lot of great carrots within that program, and encourage folks to look at it. Marin County CERT and San Rafael CERT, so CERT, Community Emergency Response Team. If you're really into this stuff and you want to learn about first aid and light search and rescue and how you can help yourself and your community during a disaster, it's a great class. We actually are hosting one coming up in April. It'll be 4 Tuesdays and then a Saturday. It's really fun, hands-on, really, really great class. So there's information on the website, or you can reach out to me directly if you're interested in that. This one will be held out on San Pedro at St. Luke's.
I wanted to add on the last note is that if there is an emergency, the person you're going to probably rely on the most are your neighbors. So definitely get to know your neighbors and understand each other's needs and necessities so that in the case of an emergency, you can actually rely on each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Neighborhood response groups, all sorts of great resources there. So we've got Rafael Zahar is our community disaster preparedness specialist, and we're happy to work with you on whatever you think your community needs. I've also got a great 1 hour to get ready presentation that's really focused on what can you do in 1 hour to be more prepared. So we talk about evacuations plans, go bags, changes you can make around your home. That's available on YouTube, but I'm also happy to do them for individual HOAs and neighborhood associations if you're interested. So just let us know. This is a great question. So can street parking accommodate people with disabilities? So the answer is we want to assure people that need to be parking close to their homes can. The more complicated answer is to actually create what you think of as like the blue line, ADA, handicap accessible space. There's a lot of regulations around that. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, paint my parking spot blue and then it's only mine. It needs to meet a lot of different standards for it to actually be an ADA spot per se. So depending on the environment, we can certainly look into it. And Lauren's definitely more of an expert on the details therein if anyone has specific questions, but it's something we can look at, but it's not quite as simple as just putting up a placard, if you will. So we're going to dive into general questions. I'm going to answer the ones in the chat and then I'll turn off the recording and open it up to general things. So there's a comment essentially about what about vegetation work? So houses, lots with a fire hazard, nothing's been done by the city. So totally agree. Let's prevent the fires. We have been doing a lot, so it really depends on the specific lot. And if you have an address you're concerned about, please send it directly to us. But we've been doing wildfire evaluations all winter with a focus on vacant lots as well as the high hazard evaluations. We've seen some neighborhoods go from 20% compliance to 50 and 60% compliance in 6 to 8 months, and we continue to offer those services. That's where the grants and the chipper days and things like that come into play as well. And the city's also got a lot of open space projects going on right now. We just did a big fuel reduction project along one of the Bristol Park fire roads to really create a good shaded fuel break. We're doing a lot of broom pulls throughout downtown. San Rafael Lincoln Hill has been treated on a couple occasions. Our grazing program will start here in May, a little bit weather dependent. So there's a lot of work happening, but we're happy to look into the specific, any specific concern and work with those property owners and go through the process we need to. So I can give you the link to the website too for all the other efforts kind of underway. There's a specific question about a street, so I'm going to hold off on that till the end. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording so we can open it up for broader discussion.